I think I can see everybody. Delighted to be here today. So what I'm going to do, as Ria has said, is give a brief recap of where things stand on the negotiations and then blast over to Brussels and see what's been going on in Europe while we've been in the midst of our Brexit travails. So let us begin. So we are now over 3 years following the EU referendum and over 2 years, 2.25 years following the launch of what was supposed to be a 2-year process for negotiating the UK's orderly withdrawal from the European Union. We are, as you know, still full members of the European Union. However, following the launch of the negotiations, these monthly negotiations which began in 2017, these were kind of highly strained, charged political negotiations, an agreement was reached. A very impressive withdrawal agreement was reached between the UK government and the European negotiators. And this was to ensure the UK's orderly withdrawal from the European Union. So it came by way of the withdrawal agreement. It would be a legally binding text that addressed the 3 key issues that the European says are fundamental to ensuring the UK's orderly withdrawal. So these 3 issues included in the withdrawal agreement are citizens' rights, the financial settlement, and the border on the island of Ireland, particularly known as the Northern Ireland backstop. And also contained within that withdrawal agreement was provision for a transition period. So when the UK has left the European Union, a time of stability during which the negotiations about that future relationship between the UK and the European Union were to take place. And then attached to the withdrawal agreement is a non-legally binding document called the Political Declaration, which sets out a framework for that future relationship between the UK and the European Union. So this rather impressive, complex text has been approved by the EU 27 member states. However, it has been rejected 3 times by the House of Commons. Now, let us keep it clear in our minds, if the UK is going to leave in an orderly way, then it needs to leave with a withdrawal agreement. And there are only 3 scenarios here. However, we may reach any of these scenarios through a general election, a referendum, whatever it may be, but these are the final scenarios. Either the UK leaves with a withdrawal agreement, which will include a transition period, or the UK will leave without a withdrawal agreement, and this is the no-deal Brexit, which would be, I very comfortably argue, a chaotic, deeply damaging Brexit in economically, politically, geopolitically, and socially. Or the UK can revoke Article 50 and remain within the European Union. And these are the 3 options. Now, we are at the moment at something of an impasse because the withdrawal agreement has been rejected 3 times by the House of Commons. Also, the House of Commons does not support a no-deal Brexit. And there is certainly not a majority for revoking Article 50. Now, whilst we are at this impasse, let us say, the clock is ticking, and the clock is currently ticking down to the current exit date for the UK, which is 11 p.m. on Thursday, the 31st of October 2019. Now, this is an extended Brexit deadline. So originally, by the original planning, the UK was going to leave the European Union on the 29th of March. Then the UK requested and was granted an extension to the 12th of April. And then the UK requested and was granted another extension to the 31st of October. And we should keep it clear in our minds that in order for the UK to have achieved these extensions, there needs to be full approval of the EU 27 member states. So they approved both of those extensions. However, we're seeing kind of increasing reluctance to grant a further extension beyond the 31st of October. So, what lies ahead? Well, let us remember that actually this was supposed to be the easy bit of Brexit. This was supposed to be dealing with the more technical questions surrounding the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. However, And one of the reasons this has been so tricky is because it's intimately bound up with questions about the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. And the EU has been really keen to keep these two things separate, but they are obviously overlapping each other. The UK will have to make a decision about what kind of state it wants to be post-Brexit. Does it want to have a close relationship with the European Union and maintain alignment with those European regulations? Or does it want to cut its ties with the European Union and sail off in a different direction? We are far from achieving a consensus in the UK about this question. But this is what is going to be monopolising our political and some of our public thinking over the coming weeks, months, and years. Now, in terms of the European view on this, well, the European Union, when the UK voted to leave, accepted but was disappointed about the UK's decision to leave the European Union. What we have seen with respect to their response is a very coherent, unified, and consistent response from the European Union, both across the institutions and also across the EU 27 member states. Over time, there's been increasing exasperation at the UK's inability to articulate a very clear post-Brexit landing zone. So what are the UK's Brexit priorities? And slight bewilderment at Theresa May's failing to really robustly defend that withdrawal agreement that was reached at the end of last year. They are very clear, and this was re-articulated in recent days, that the withdrawal agreements, the substantive legal document, is not going to be changed. This is not open for a renegotiation. Where there is potential room for manoeuvre is with respect to that second text, that non-legally binding political declaration, which sets out the framework for the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. And with respect to an extension, again, what we've heard over recent days is actually hostility amongst certain ranks within the member states about granting the UK yet another Brexit extension. However, it's important to remember that actually the European Union has not solely been wallowing in a Brexit fuzz. Indeed, there have been other issues that have been occupying Europe. If you cast your mind back to immediately following the referendum, there were many people there who said that what the UK's decision to leave the European Union was going to do, it was going to thrust the European Union into a fatal existential crisis, and we would ultimately see the disintegration of the European Union. However, the European Union has been reaping something of a Brexit dividend, and actually what we've seen is support for the European project increase since the UK's referendum. And something of a litmus test here, although I agree it is imperfect, is if we look to the European parliamentary elections. Now, this is something that has been monopolising Europe for a number of months. You will all be aware the UK also took part in these European parliamentary elections, and it's quite interesting to look at the overall results from these elections. So what we've actually seen is that those two big groups within the European Parliament, so the centre-left and centre-right groups, they have lost votes, but the parties sweeping up most of these votes are actually Renew Europe, which is where the Liberal Democrats sit, and also Greens and the European Free Alliance, which is where Plaid Cymru sits. So even though we did see those increases from the more right-wing populist parties, they were not to the extent that some had anticipated. Some had really anticipated a surge in support for the right wing, and that was not something that we saw with these European parliamentary elections. Now, beyond the European parliamentary elections, Brussels has been busy with thinking about EU top jobs, because something that we're going to see later this year is a change of guard in the European institutions. And this is really important for us as we're following Brexit and thinking about that future relationship. So those key leaders within those key institutions will be changing later this year. Now, when these individuals are in post, we will have a better idea of, or a clearer idea of, the legislative and policy direction of travel. However, we're getting a sense of the kind of issues that are going to be firmly on the European agenda over the coming years. And just looking at the discussions that are going on and looking at what was supposed to be the first European summit following Brexit, which took place in Romania in Sibiu, so brought together the heads of state of the 27 member states, and obviously the UK was still a member. However, Theresa May politely declined the invitation. We can see that the European Union is going to be forging ahead on a number of fronts, continuing work on trade policy, so under the umbrella of harnessing globalisation. Defence cooperation, now that the UK is not going to be that vetoing power post-Brexit. A deepening of economic and monetary union, and work around climate change. And these are just some of the areas where we'll see this European activity. I admit this list is not exhaustive. And also, that is not to say that the European Union is not without its own challenges. It's actually having to address a number of complex, significant challenges. However, it's actually doing this now against the backdrop of increased support in European membership and kind of for some a more favourable result to those European parliamentary elections. So, we will know more about the direction of travel of the European Union in the autumn, when those positions are in post, when the European Commission President has given his or her first State of the Union address. And it's really important for us here to keep an eye on how the European Union is developing, because this will influence the Brexit negotiations and the negotiations around that future relationship between the UK and the European Union, and also Wales. So at that point, I will leave you and hand over to Joe. Thank you.